I've been playing for 7.5 hours. When I pick up Queen 6 suited in the hijack, I open to 120. The button calls. He's the same opponent from the last hand. We're heads up out of position.
In this episode of Weekly Poker Hand, world-class video blogger Brad Owen raises it up to $120, playing about $17,000 deep at 2040, no-limit Texas variety with Queen 6 of spades. A little bit loose, a little bit splashy, but I think it's perfectly fine if you're not going to get 3-bet quite often enough. And in live poker, very often you do not get 3-bet quite often enough, so you can raise a little bit wider than perhaps a GTO chart recommends. He bumps it up to $120. The button calls. Let's go to the flop.
The flop comes 10-4 deuce with 2 spades. We've got a flush draw, 1 over, and a backdoor straight draw. I bet 200 to potentially take it down without having to make a hand. The button isn't going to let me. He raises to 600. This isn't a particularly great situation to be in. He could be doing this with some kind of better flush draw than me, like ace-3 or ace-5 of spades. It's only 400 more though. I call.
The flop comes 10 of spades, 4 of spades, 2 of clubs, giving Brad the queen high flush draw. He continuation bets $200 into the $330 pot, which is perfectly fine and reasonable. That said, you do have to be careful to not continuation bet too often when you are out of position, just because you completely lack position, and position is power when you're playing deep stacked no limit hold'em. However, in live poker, where I think players generally don't raise quite often enough and they fold a little bit too often, and perhaps their ranges are just too weak to begin with before the flop, because they call with a bunch of junky stuff pre-flop, I think this is a fine spot to go for a continuation bet far more often than any sort of game theory optimal solver would recommend. So Brad goes 200, he immediately gets raised to 600. And now his flush draw shrivels up a lot, because what does a raising range look like? Well, it's probably going to be a lot of good strong made hands, like sets, 2 pairs, which are unlikely, top pair good kickers, and high equity draws, and maybe some junky draws. So how does Brad do against the high equity draws, like ace X of spades and king X of spades? Well, not very good at all, right? How does he do against sets? Not very good at all. How about junky draws? Well, he's crushing them, but if he fails to improve, he's just going to get bluffed off his hand on the turn and or river. So this is a pretty nasty scenario. However, pot odds exist. He has to put in 400 to try to win something like 1,500 total. And because of that, I think you have a pretty easy call. Anytime you have a draw that's likely good if you get there, not always, but likely good, and you're getting anywhere near the break-even price to call, even from out of position, in a heads-up pot, you usually need to continue. And when you have additional equity, like a queen, if a queen comes on the turn, you could easily be good, maybe even a 6, you definitely can't go around folding. So stick around and try to improve.
The turn is the 8 of spades. We drill the 3rd nuts. I'm still not sure if it's good. I check to see how the button's gonna play this. He's not easing my concerns. He fires for 1,300. I guess the button isn't worried at all about the flush draw getting there. I make another call, knowing that I could be drawing completely dead.
The turn is the 8 of spades, giving Brad the queen high flush, 3rd nuts as he says. He checks, and the opponent bets almost the size of the pot, 1,300 into 1,530. And Brad correctly realizes at this point that if he decides to raise and get his entire $17,000 in at some point by the river, he may not be loving this spot, because he's only going to be getting it in against the jack high flush, 9 high flush, 7 high flush, and given he has the 6 in his hand, he blocks some of those. So this is not a great spot. There's a whole lot more combinations of ace X of spades and king X of spades than there are of weaker flushes. Now, we are playing perhaps a loosey-goosey live cash game, so maybe you can just raise and get it in against a lot of players. But at the same time, this is a spot where when you are out of position, you need to proceed cautiously. Anytime you check the turn and your opponent blast it, your raising range needs to be very, 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 very polarized to the nuts and some draws, usually to the nuts. Brad has a good hand, but not the nuts. So in this spot, he has to call and go to the river. Good play so far.
The river is the 5 of diamonds. I check. This pot has gotten really big. I'm not all that comfortable. I'm even less comfortable when the button fires for $4,000.
The river is the 5 of diamonds. Brad checks, and his opponent pots it again. What do you think Brad's going to do with the queen high flush?
This is absolutely insane. I have the 3rd nuts, but I feel like I have a bluff catcher. If I call, it'll be a pot of over $12,000. It'll break the record for the biggest pot that I've ever played, which was $10,000 when I lost that one a few hours ago. If I win, I'll be up $3,500 for the session and $4,600 total for the day. If I lose, I'll be in the hole about $9,000 on the session. Nearly every time that I made a big river call, I've been wrong. Somehow, I haven't learned my lesson. I just don't have it in me to fold a hand that's this strong, so I brace myself for the bad news one more time, and I put in calling chips. The opponent's quick to turn over Jack Deuce of spades for a slightly smaller flush. He might like Jack Deuce suited a little too much. He gets totally punished for playing it this time. I have him notched to win by far the largest pot of my life. Excuse the language, but what a wild ride today has been.
Brad correctly realizes that this is just a bluff catcher on the river. If he raises, he's probably only going to get called by a few weaker flushes and all the better hands. So he makes the call. He's shown the Jack 2 of spades, and he wins the biggest pot he's ever played up until this point in his poker vlogging career. Before we wrap it up today, I want to know, what is the biggest pot you have ever played? Take a second, think about it. Let me know in the comments section down below, and I'll come back and talk to you about the biggest pot I've ever played. And while you're down there, click the like and subscribe button. The biggest effective pot I ever won was Heads Up in the Foxwoods WPT. This is half of the trophy. The rest of it's back there in the bookshelf somewhere. I beat poker coaching coach Jonathan Jaffe heads up and won $1.05 million. I don't remember what the hand was because honestly, it doesn't matter. I was trying to say or think about the biggest cash game hand I've ever played, and I honestly don't remember. I've played a few $200,000 pots, but it really doesn't matter because whenever you play a cash game hand, you are making some amount of money or losing some amount of money every single hand you are dealt in on average, based on your skill level in relation to your opponents, the rake, the structure of the game, etc., etc. Whether or not you win or lose a huge pot does not matter at the end of the day. All that really matters is your ability to sit and play good, sane, logical poker. You don't want to be all frazzled thinking, oh, this is the biggest pot I've ever played. I hope I don't lose it. No, none of that matters. I know that in a lot of video games today, people get badges and awards and accolades like, oh, you beat this opponent 16 times in a row, or you did this crazy thing 4 times in a row. You're so good. And a lot of people like to relate those type of things to poker, like, oh, you played the biggest pot you've ever played, or you made a straight flush. But it doesn't matter. Stay sane, focus on what actually does matter, which is pretty much playing in games where you have an edge consistently over the long run, and the money will flow your direction. I'll talk to you next time.